She stood on an Olympic podium with more medals than almost anyone in the history of her sport, and just weeks before this video was written, she told the world that she had nearly died. Not in a gym, not on a vault runway, in an ordinary week, in an ordinary hospital, far from any arena, the most decorated gymnast alive found herself fighting for her life in a way no scoreboard could ever measure. At 29 years old, after more than 2 decades of pushing her body past limits most people can't imagine, Simone Biles was forced to confront something no championship ever prepared her for: her own mortality. That single admission cracked open a story that had been building quietly for years. For most of her career, the public saw a woman who appeared unbreakable, someone whose body seemed to defy the ordinary rules of physics and fatigue. What the cameras rarely captured was the price tag attached to that illusion. Behind every perfect landing was a body absorbing an almost unbelievable amount of impact, and behind every flawless expression was a mind carrying weight that had nowhere to go. Her story isn't just about a health scare. It's about what happens when a person is asked, again and again, to be more than human, and what it costs when the human part finally demands to be noticed. To understand how she reached that hospital bed, you have to go back to where everything started, long before medals and record books, in a childhood defined by instability rather than achievement. Simone Biles was born in Columbus, Ohio, into a home that struggled to hold together. By the time she was a toddler, her mother could no longer care for her 4 children, and Simone and her siblings entered the foster care system, spending some of their earliest years separated from their biological parents. It was the kind of beginning that derails far more lives than it builds. What saved her trajectory was her grandfather, Ron Biles, and his wife Nellie, who drove from Texas, took Simone and her sister into their home, and eventually adopted both girls. That single act of love gave a scattered childhood a foundation to stand on. It was in Spring, Texas, at around 6 years old, that a daycare field trip to a gymnastics gym changed the direction of her entire life. She moved through the equipment with an instinct that caught the coach's attention, and a letter went home inviting her to train formally. It reads now like a small, almost accidental beginning to something enormous. By age 8, she was already competing, and the routine that would define the next 2 decades of her life had begun. 6 days a week, roughly 8 hours a day, training under coach Amy Borman outside Houston. It was a rare combination of raw talent and relentless repetition, and it built the foundation for everything that followed. Her rise, once it started, barely paused. At 16, she won her first world championship all-around title, then repeated that feat the following 3 years in a row, an unprecedented run of dominance in a sport where reigns are usually short and fragile. Her skills became so distinct that several moves on floor, vault, and beam were officially named after her by the International Gymnastics Federation, a rare recognition that essentially meant she was performing feats no one else in the world dared attempt in competition. By the time the 2016 Rio Olympics arrived, she wasn't just a favorite, she was a phenomenon, walking away with 4 golds and a bronze and becoming a cultural icon almost overnight. From the outside, it looked like an uninterrupted climb toward greatness. What it didn't show was the accumulation happening underneath. Elite gymnastics doesn't damage the body in one dramatic moment. It wears it down slowly, landing after landing, year after year, until stress fractures and joint strain become something to manage rather than something to fear. Starting serious training at 8 years old meant Simone's ankles, knees, and spine were absorbing punishing forces for over a decade and a half before she'd even reached her physical prime. The very skills that made her a legend, the ones bearing her name, required a level of speed, torque, and control that few bodies could tolerate even once, let alone thousands of times in competition and training. Think about what a single vault actually demands. A gymnast sprints down a runway at close to full speed, launches off a springboard, drives off her hands for a fraction of a second, and then rotates her entire body through multiple flips and twists before absorbing the full force of landing through her ankles and knees. Now multiply that by thousands of repetitions across years of training, Add in balance beam routines performed on a surface 4 inches wide, and floor passes that require repeated high-impact tumbling on a single competition day. Most people would struggle to survive that physical workload for a single season. Simone did it at an elite level for the better part of 2 decades, and she did it while also being expected to look effortless every single time a camera was pointed at her. That expectation of effortlessness is part of what makes her story so layered. Fans and commentators often praised her for making impossibly difficult skills look easy, without stopping to consider what easy was actually costing her behind the scenes. Slow-motion replays turned her body into a kind of spectacle, something to be admired and dissected frame by frame, while the actual physical sensation of that landing, the jolt through her spine, the strain in her joints, remained invisible to everyone but her. Sports science can measure force and rotation, but it can't fully capture what it feels like to live inside a body that's been asked to do the extraordinary on command, over and over, for most of a lifetime. That physical strain didn't stay contained to her body. It bled into her mental state in ways that became impossible to hide during the Tokyo Olympics in 2021, when Simone experienced what gymnasts call the twisties, a frightening loss of spatial awareness in midair that turns a routine into a genuine safety risk. It isn't nerves or stage fright. It's a disconnect between what the body is doing and what the brain expects, and in a sport built on split-second timing, it can be dangerous enough to cause serious injury. Simone withdrew from multiple events, a decision that sparked global debate, much of it missing the deeper point entirely. The conversation focused on whether she should have competed, when the real story was what years of unaddressed pressure had done to bring her to that breaking point in the first place. In the years between Tokyo and the next Olympic cycle, Simone spoke more openly than ever about therapy and the process of learning to separate her identity from the expectation of constant perfection. She married NFL player Jonathan Owens in 2023, found some measure of stability in her personal life, and returned to competition that same year, reclaiming the World Championship all-around title and proving her comeback was real, not just a farewell tour. By the 2024 Paris Olympics, she was performing at a level that arguably surpassed her pre-Tokyo form, winning gold in the team event, the individual all-around, and vault, along with a silver in floor. On paper, it was a complete redemption story. But even that triumphant return carried a cost that stayed mostly out of public view. In an interview with a French outlet L'Equipe roughly a year after the Paris Games, Simone described what her body went through once the competition ended. She recalled returning to the athlete's village, stepping into an elevator, and having her body essentially give out from exhaustion, leaving her sick for over a week afterward. She also mentioned that something as ordinary as sprinting in a garden with friends left her sore for days, a small but telling detail about just how much where more than 2 decades of elite training had left behind. Even with her body aging and every instinct telling her to slow down, she admitted she still wasn't sure whether she'd attempt one more Olympic cycle. Then, in the summer of 2026, came the moment that reframed everything. Simone shared on social media that she had experienced a medical emergency serious enough that, in her own words, it could have ended very differently. She described it as one of the most frightening experiences of her life, made harder by the fact that her husband was away for football practice at the time. She spent the following week resting, telling followers only that she would share more details eventually. When some online commenters mocked her for later posting vacation photos, apparently doubting the seriousness of what she'd gone through, she responded directly, explaining that the experience had genuinely shifted her perspective on life and asking for a little more understanding. Weeks later, she was back in a hospital for a follow-up procedure, this time with her husband by her side, choosing to keep most of the medical specifics private while still letting fans know she was healing. What stands out about all of this isn't just the health scare itself, it's the pattern it reveals. For years, the public narrative around Simone Biles was built on invincibility. Every slow-motion replay of a gravity-defying vault, every gold medal ceremony, every record broken, reinforced the idea that she operated on a different physical plane than everyone else. That story was inspiring, and it wasn't entirely false, but it left almost no room for the version of Simone who was quietly absorbing damage the whole time. The gap between the highlight reel and the lived reality is where her real story lives, and it's a gap that elite sports, as an industry, rarely make space to talk about honestly. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that a woman with more world championship medals than any gymnast in history, a woman with feats of athleticism literally named after her, still had to publicly explain that almost dying wasn't something she expected to deal with in an ordinary week. It says less about her personally and more about how society tends to treat its most gifted athletes, as symbols first and people second. When someone is elevated to that level of mythology, admitting fragility can feel almost like betrayal, both to the fans who need the myth and, more quietly, to the athlete who's been taught that stopping is failure. Simone's response to all of this, though, has increasingly leaned toward honesty rather than performance. Her willingness to talk about the twisties in Tokyo, her comments to L'Equipe about her body's slow recovery, and her candid posts about the 2026 medical scare all point towards someone actively rewriting the terms of what strength is allowed to look like. She's not hiding the toll anymore. She's naming it publicly in real time, even when that invites scrutiny or skepticism from strangers online. That, in its own way, is its own kind of courage, arguably a rarer one than the courage it takes to nail a routine most gymnasts wouldn't dream of attempting. It's worth remembering that none of this erases what she's built. 11 Olympic medals, dozens of world championship titles, and a legacy of skills that carry her name into gymnastics history books are not diminished by admitting that greatness has a body count of its own. If anything, the full picture makes the achievement more remarkable, not less. It's easy to be impressed by someone who appears untouchable. It's harder and more meaningful to appreciate someone who kept showing up while quietly managing pain, fear, and now a genuine brush with a medical emergency that could have ended everything. There's also something instructive in how differently Simone has chosen to talk about all of this compared to earlier in her career. In her younger years, the public version of her story was mostly told through results, scores, whatever she decides about 2028, broken, whether she competes in her late 20s, steps fully she's
into
the
life
one narrating the
gymnastics.
parts that used to stay
The version
hidden,
of her story
choosing
that
which
matters
details
most
to
may
share
not be written
and
on a
which to keep
competition
private.
floor at all.
But
It
it might
refusing
simply
to let
be
the
the fact that
conversation
she
be
survived a
only about
health scare
outcomes.
serious enough
That
to make
shift
her
matters
rethink her own
beyond her own
mortality.
life.
Chose
Young
to speak about
athletes
it
coming up
honestly
behind her,
instead of
especially
especially
young
young
women
women
in
in sports
curated
that
highlight
reward
reel
thinness
and
flexibility
flexibility,
and
even
constant
to strangers
availability
online
are
who
watching
doubted
how
her,
she handles
that her
this moment.
experience was real
Watching someone
and
at the
worth
very
taking
top of a
seriously.
sport say
That
in the
plainly
end
that
might
her
be the
body
most
has limits,
quietly
and that
radical
those
thing
limits
a
deserve
record-breaking
respect
athlete
rather
can
than
do.
denial,
Chips
chips
away
to keep
at a
performing
culture that has
invincibility.
historically
Once
treated
it stops
rest
being
as
true.
weakness and
Simone
injury
Biles
as an
heard what her
inconvenience
body
to
was
push
telling
through.
her.
It
The
also
only
raises
question now is
uncomfortable
whether the
but
rest of us
necessary
are
questions
finally
about
ready
how
to
the
listen
sports
to.
world supports athletes once the cameras stop rolling. Gymnastics, like many high-performance sports, tends to measure success almost entirely in the years leading up to a competition, with far less attention paid to what recovery looks like afterward, or what long-term toll 2 decades of that intensity leaves behind. Simone's account of her body giving out in elevator months after Paris, or facing a health emergency serious enough to require hospitalization years into what should have been a slower, calmer chapter of her career, suggests that the reckoning doesn't end when the competing does. The body keeps a ledger long after the medals stop being counted. As she continues recovering and weighing whether the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics are even a possibility, the biggest question isn't really about her competitive future. It's about whether the culture around elite sport can learn to see its champions as whole people rather than symbols expected to perform strength indefinitely. Simone Biles spent years being asked to be superhuman. What her recent health scare has forced into the open is a much simpler, much more human truth. Even the greatest athlete in the world has limits, and pretending otherwise was never really protecting her. It was only protecting the story everyone wanted to believe. Her journey, from a chaotic start in foster care to global icon to someone honest enough to say she almost didn't survive a routine week, tells a story far more complicated and far more compelling than any highlight reel could capture. It's a reminder that behind every gold medal is a person, and behind every person is a body and a mind that eventually ask to be heard.